So good morning. My name is Eric Barron, and I have been a member of the Knight Commission for 7 years. I had the honor of serving as president at Florida State University and retired as president emeritus at Penn State University. So I certainly have a lot of empathy for what many college presidents are navigating today. I would like to welcome our guests here in person and those joining by Zoom. I am going to repeat Len's housekeeping issues. The session is being recorded. The recorded video and other meeting materials will be available on knightcommission.org. We have a large virtual audience, so I encourage commission members and our panelists always use your microphone and speak clearly and loudly so that the entire virtual audience can hear you. We're fortunate this morning to hear directly from Senator Maria Cantwell, who's involved in designing potential solutions for the future of college sports. And now we will pivot to hear from former college athletes who are providing independent leadership to advocate for solutions they believe are in the best interest of athletes and college sports. After this session, NCAA Senior Vice President for External Affairs, Tim Buckley, will join us to discuss the NCAA's position on potential federal legislation. In the interest of time, and so that we can have a good, robust discussion, I'm going to provide only the briefest of introductions to our panelists. More complete bios can be found in our meeting materials provided to our in-person attendees and are also available on the meeting webpage. After I introduce the panelists, each will give their remarks before opening the floor for questions from our commission members who are joining us here today. So first, Cody Campbell, founder of Saving College Sports and chairman of the Board of Regents at Texas Tech University. Welcome. And then Brandon Copeland, co-founder and CEO of athletes.org, which is one of several organizations that are working to represent college athletes. So if you'd like to begin with your remarks.
Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to be here. It's this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. So as mentioned, I founded a 501c4 that has been working on this topic. I'm also an advisor to the White House on the issue, and have been working with them on their position on college sports, which is something that they, the president and many members of the administration, care very much about. The reason I'm here today, many people ask me, what is your why? Why are you doing this? I have no financial stake in anything that goes on with college sports. I'm a big Texas Tech supporter, so people assume, well, you're just doing this to help Texas Tech. I'm here because of the student athletes. I would not be in the position that I'm in. Part of my bio that wasn't mentioned is that I run a multi-billion-dollar oil and gas company in Texas and have sold $15 billion of companies over the course of the last 15 or 17 years, and have had a lot of success. And I know that success is largely attributable to the lessons I learned, the opportunities I received through the opportunity to play college sports. And so my goal and my mission is to ensure that as many young people in this country enjoy the same opportunity that I got as a student athlete myself. The work ethic, the learning how to deal with adversity, bounce back when you're punched in the mouth, teamwork, goes on and on. It's not a coincidence that 60% of the CEOs in this country have a college sports background. It's an incredible leadership development tool that we have in this country that really no other country has, plus the Olympics aspect of it, plus what it does for women. The statistics on women are so crazy. I don't even want to quote them, but something around 94% of women in C-suite roles have a sports background. So the impact that sports and college sports in particular have on young people in this country is unbelievable. Plus the teammates that I knew who their only opportunity in life to get out of just horrible situations was that, scholarship that they received to go play whatever sport it was. And in my opinion, the opportunity that the high jumper gets at Fresno State is just as important as the opportunity that the football player gets at the University of Georgia. They all need to be protected. And I feel like that student athletes have been lost in this discussion, right? It's all the folks that have the largest voices on the Hill, for sure. Those who have been in control for a very long time are the ones that are making the money off of it. And I think that greed has overwhelmed the system to some extent, and that's why we're in the position we are. I really hate that I've had to be critical of the NCAA in certain cases through all this process, because I think a lot of Charlie Baker and think he's done a great job. I don't think he created the sort of problems that it has, but I think we have issues there. But probably the bigger issue that we have right now is that the conferences, when we talk about the SCORE Act, we talk about the SAFE Act, we talk about all the discussions going on in DC right now, the conferences are all represented by commissioners who are very, very self-interested. And when you hear them speak publicly, again, there's no mention of the student athletes and what's happening to them. There's mention of what, a lot of different things, but definitely not the student athletes, and not a lot of solutions other than just exceptionally broad antitrust exemptions and basically taking us back 40 years in time when the athletes had absolutely no rights, to anything. I think that the fundamental problems in college sports are oftentimes focused on NIL and the transfer portal and, the rules there. Those are, I think, more symptoms than they are the fundamental problem. I think we have a problem with governance. We obviously do not have a governing body that has an ability it's empowered and able to make and set rules, and sports need rules, and I think we all agree on that. And we need to find a way for an organization to be empowered that does represent the student athletes, that represents the small sports, the women's sports, the Olympic sports, the small schools, represents everybody. But then also we have a major economic problem in college sports that was discussed by Senator Cantwell. I was extremely encouraged by her bill that was released recently, the SAFE Act. And I don't want to speak for the White House because they have not publicly announced a platform, but if you read the president's executive order and you read Senator Cantwell's legislation, you can find a lot more alignment between those two than you can between the executive order and the SCORE Act. Now, I'm not a political creature. I'm a businessman. I'm a former football player. So maybe I should be more careful in the words that I use. But I think that we have to have a real conversation around whether it makes sense or not for the SCORE Act to advance in the House, as it stands right now. Does that mean that we all know that something has to be done legislatively, right? But that thing is such a blunt instrument. Does it confuse the conversation as it goes to the Senate? Ultimately, I think the whole discussion is going to come down to, what happens in the Commerce Committee in the Senate and the solutions that they come up with there. There are some things that, Senator Cruz, the chairman, advocates for that are good ideas, but the solutions are not comprehensive. Again, they don't address the governance issue and they don't address the revenue issue at all. And we have to do those in order to solve the problem if we want to sustain this thing that is so great for our country. So I'm here to try to find solutions. I'm here to try to bring people together to have a conversation, because I think at the end of the day, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, left or right, I found it to be true. There are people who want the right thing and want to do the right thing, that truly care about college sports, that are Republicans and Democrats. This is not a partisan issue. This is something that everyone can come together on and find a solution for. However, there are powerful special interests and individuals who want to disrupt that conversation. They don't want it to happen. They don't want the right solutions to be found because it affects them personally. And when I see someone in favor of personal greed hurting the opportunities and the futures of student athletes, I have no time for that person, right? In fact, I have disdain for that person, and am willing to go back to my old offensive line days and, kind of summon some of those those attitudes toward folks like that. And so that's what you're going to see me and my organization do, is just continue to fight for this system, for the opportunity that it provides, for what it means to communities, for what it means to our Olympics programs. And, I really think that's the key to the whole thing, because that's really what's at risk. Look, football, men's basketball, they make money virtually everywhere. The other sports don't. The other sports are at risk. Women's sports and Olympic sports are at risk here. And that's what we are trying to save. That's what the White House is focused on. And again, I was encouraged that Senator Cantwell's legislation is also focused on the same thing. So thank you all for having me here today. Again, I'm an open book. The good thing about me is there's nothing they can really do to me. So, this isn't my business. I've done really well in my life, so I can kind of speak the truth and have no other agenda other than making sure that the right thing is done. So feel free to ask me whatever, and I'll answer it. So thank you for having me, and
Thank you,
Brandon. Yeah,
Brandon.
Well, good morning, everybody. I guess it's still morning. I appreciate you all having me here. Cody, appreciate those remarks as well, too. One, thank you all for actually inviting the athletes' perspective into the room. My name is Brandon Copeland, co-founder of athletes.org, former NFL player, played 10 years in the league. And what we've built is what we believe is the Players Association for college athletes, right? And when I say that, I will definitely be respectful to some of the other organizations that are out there, because I think that they've done incredible work to get us to this point. However, as a former NFL player, undrafted free agent, went to the Baltimore Ravens in 2013, which is actually my hometown team. And what I always tell people, if there wasn't an NFLPA, an NFL Players Association, then I would have signed up to play for the Baltimore Ravens for a pack of gum, some Gatorade, and a really good look at Ray Lewis's locker, right? But the NFLPA negotiated for me on my behalf and for all of my peers to set a floor of how you could treat me as a human being and as an athlete. And right now, when you look at college athletics, there is no Players Association, there is no representation for the athletes that actually has power and has weight in the negotiating rooms to make sure that the athletes don't end up on the menu. What we like to say is, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're bound to end up on the menu. And so a lot of the conversations, the bills that we're talking about proposing, potentially giving the NCAA and conferences antitrust exemption, a lot of those things to me mean nothing, because you can throw as much money at this problem as you want to, but if you don't fix the root cause of the issue, which is bringing the athletes to the table, allowing them to actually help set the rules, set the standards, set practice time, set off-season calendars, tell you when the transfer portal should be, and weigh in on those things, then you will always be limiting the earning potential of a group of human beings, right? You don't do it to any other student on campus. And let's dive into how we actually got here in the first place. The last thing I'll say is, again, one of the things, and I won't take credit for this, my co-founder has said it so well, Jim Cavall, who actually comes from building businesses to help in the college sports space. He built a company called Influencer. It was acquired by Teamworks, but he got a chance to see a bunch, over $100 million in NIL transactions, which is where he saw that this was a house of cards. You had donors paying for the running back, paying for the tight end to come to a university. We're calling it name, image, and likeness, but really the person is there to play football or basketball or tennis, whatever that may be, right? Or softball. So when you create that deck of cards or that house of cards, eventually you have real life examples like Florida State last year going 0-2, and people saying, I'm not paying my hard-earned money to pay that athlete. And where the money should have come from the entire time is from the university, sharing in the revenue that they were generating off of concession stands, ticket sales, and a number of other ways that they grow money with the people who actually help them produce it. Now, I do believe, again, what we're going to talk about here as well, too, is Olympic sports, women's sports should be protected. And I'll dive into how athletes.org is actually set up and structured because, one, I'm an Ivy League football player. Went to the University of Pennsylvania. I am very, very comfortable saying that my opinion on SEC football should not matter. I'm an Ivy League football player. It's okay to say that, right? The things that a women's softball player is dealing with in the SEC versus a women's softball player in the ACC are different. But if you don't structure an organization in a way where you can get their individual feedback so that you can go out and advocate for their needs and their interests, then you don't have a chance. And right now, again, we're trying to solve a problem at a global or macro level of let's just pump money into this system, but we're not solving the actual issues that got us here in the first place. So if we can go to the next slide, please, appreciate you. So next slide. First, in 1955, there was a guy named Ray Dennison who passed away after a brain injury on the football field, okay? His wife, Billy, ended up filing for workers' compensation to try to get the NCAA to pay for to pay the family as a result of his death, right? And so the NCAA comes up with a term called student athlete, and that's where this term was born, okay? And by coming up with this term called student athlete, the NCAA was allowed to not have to pay workers' compensation because Ray was a student and he wasn't employed as an athlete. He dodged the employee laws, so to speak, right? But I always like to start there because a lot of the things that we are contemplating are a result of marketing genius. And since then, Walter Byers, who's passed away, but he was the CEO of the NCAA at the time, has actually come out and refuted the fact that coming up with that term was wrong, all right? So next to him, you see Kent Waldrop, and then you also see Medrick Burnett. Medrick actually passed away last November as a result of a brain injury sustained on the football field as well, too. Kent, his family sued for workers' compensation, but again, they used the term student athlete to avoid having to pay him, all right? So let's move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Now you've had the O'Bannon case, the Austin case, and obviously the House settlement. And the one thing I'll call out here, because I don't want to put you guys in slides this entire time, but the one thing I call out here is we've invented this term called name, image, and likeness, okay? I played in the NFL, right? We always called it a marketing deal, an endorsement, a sponsorship. Patrick Mahomes gets paid a whole lot of money by the Kansas City Chiefs to throw touchdowns, period, okay? He gets paid money by State Farm, Gatorade, Whoop, all these other brands for his name, his image, and his likeness, okay? So instead of, at that point in time, saying, you know what, we're bringing these athletes here to play a sport, let's call it what it is, the NCAA and the leaders created the term name, image, and likeness, which again is just a marketing deal. It always has been. And they have been paying athletes through name, image, and likeness so that they avoid paying them to play or triggering employment status. Again, that same student athlete mechanism is the same thing that's happening with name, image, and likeness. All right. We can go to the next slide, please. Again, next slide. You guys get that point. Right now, I call out in this slide, these are quarterbacks, Teddy Bridgewater, Carson Wentz, who are making less on their NFL contract than some college athletes. And right now, we're in Virginia right now, but the Washington Commanders, if you went and tried to pick out 10 guys on the Washington Commanders that were making money for their name, image, and likeness, you would have a very, very hard time. Yet we're saying that the entire college football roster of your favorite university should be paid for their name, image, and likeness. This is not me saying that athletes don't deserve to be paid. This is me saying, as a guy who is interested in real estate, if I have a shaky foundation, it's time to remove that foundation and start new, is what I'll say. We can go to the next slide, please. I also want to call out really quickly, and again, I promise to turn the microphone over, but I want to call out really quickly that right now we're talking about how unsustainable college sports is, and we're saying that we're doing everything the leaders are doing everything in their power to convince the world that it's the athlete's fault. And the athletes are not loyal, and they're transferring all the time. And we have over 4,800 athletes, and we have stories and contracts and receipts of how don't just believe everything that the media is telling you. Okay? No offense to the media. It's not your fault, right? But again, we have athletes who've talked about their coaches ripping up their contracts in their spring football meeting and saying, hey, you will never, ever, ever play a snap here. Do with that information as you wish. Okay? The athletes didn't file suits against the NCAA. The athletes aren't discussing private equity deals. The athletes haven't gotten us to this position that we're currently in, yet we're in these rooms and lawmakers are trying to make bills to prevent the athletes from continuing to make this system unsustainable. Newsflash, the athletes didn't get us here, right? The folks in power, the folks in leadership, and I agree with you, I believe Charlie Baker isn't the one who technically got us here, and he's doing his best. But again, there weren't any athletes in the room trying to sue the NCAA to prevent schools from inducing athletes to come on recruiting visits with NIL money, okay? So we're really in here solving problems, trying to help the NCAA police itself in a problem that it got here. And we're also trying to get more money for those people who we've already talked about may or may not have their own self-interests to be able to utilize and wield against the athletes. Next slide. Again, the athletes didn't decide to offer, no offense to Jimbo Fisher, I would love that job as well too, didn't decide to offer him $77 million and fire him after 3 years and give him $60 million to sit at home, or Charlie Weiss to get $18.6 million to sit at home. But again, now it's unsustainable, right? Now that the athletes are getting paid, it's unsustainable. Next slide, please.
I want to make sure we get time for questions because
Yes,
there's
sir.
a lot of them here. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Next slide. We'll skip through this. You guys already know you'll skip through this. We'll skip through this too. Everybody has an organization besides the college athlete. And we try to say that SAC should be their organization. And I tell people, I was a member of SAC when I was at Penn. I showed up for the free Chipotle. I was not prepared to negotiate a multi-billion-dollar deal. We can actually go ahead and close up shop on the slides. We don't even have to do any more slides. So at the end of the day, what my thought process is again, if you can allow for athletes deserve to be at the table. Their blood, sweat, and tears have earned the right for them to be at the table. Right now, what we need to be spending time, and my only issue with these bills is making sure that there's a mechanism for collective bargaining in those bills. And so the athletes have a true seat at the table that can't be pushed out. They don't need to have their opinions considered. They need to be truly partners in the business of college athletics. Thank you.
Thank you. So what I would like to do is take turns so that we ask alternating questions for our two panelists, because I know there are a lot of questions and I don't want to get to the point where they're all loaded on one set of issues or not. So to go back and forth, maybe we could start with Jill. The question.
Great, thank you. Mr. Campbell, thanks for being here today, and thanks for what you're doing. My name is Jill Bodensteiner. I'm the Director of Athletics at St. Joseph's University, a proud member of the Atlantic 10. You spoke the truth. I'm going to use more polite words in my question. And so we all know how competitive the power conferences are with one another. And there have been certainly some public statements about resistance to pooling broadcasting rights. And if we amend the Sports Broadcasting Act, it would, allow but not require the pooling of broadcasting rights. How do we incentivize the power conferences to pool broadcasting rights?
Well, I think that there is a distinct difference between the members of the power conferences and the commissioners of the power conferences in terms of how they feel about this issue. The members of the power conferences are all having pretty significant, not all, but almost all are having pretty significant budget issues. We could debate why, but they are. Okay, they need more money. the problem with the way the system is set up is that the conferences are at the top of the capital stack. So they receive the media distributions. They take care of their conference costs. The commissioners get their paychecks, and then they distribute what's left to the members. And then the members are left to deal with their budgets, right? And so then in order to fill these gigantic budget holes that they have, which in the FBS, across those 136 schools, it's $20 million per year per school on average. It's not sustainable. We're using academic funds, we're using student fees. You know, some schools are lucky enough to have boosters, but there are a lot fewer of those that have them than do. And so it's a problem with the setup. The commissioners don't really care what happens at the institutional level. All they care about is what happens to them. And I think that is fundamentally the problem. So it's a misalignment of incentives, right? This thing where we're trying to force a private equity deal on an entire conference, each member institution having a very different financial situation, is crazy. The fact that we're bringing private equity into something that is, in my view, owned by the American public in college sports is outlandish. You know, we have halfway professionalized this thing, right? And so we have a professionalized cost model on one side where we pay coaches a lot, we're now paying players a lot, but we have this amateurish media rights marketing effort that makes absolutely no sense to anybody. The NBA, this is the example that people love to use, has about half as many viewers as college football does. But the NBA makes twice as much money as college football does every year. Anybody who looks at the numbers and studies it, and we've gone way deep, hired consultants and everything else, adopting the SBA will add, we believe, an additional $7 billion per year to the system, which, regardless of whether you think there's waste or whatever, $7 billion solves the problem. And it allows us to take care of the small schools, the big schools, and everybody in between. And I don't think necessarily the money has to be evenly distributed, but there's enough of it there where we can get everybody what they need to stay in business, right? So how do you get the commissioners to cooperate? You know, I think the first thing they have to do is they have to come to the table and they have to actually talk about it. So it's not just commissioners, it's also the broadcasters, right? And everybody has to understand that we're not out trying to hurt them, we're actually trying to make them more money, you know? I think that's the first thing, but they've been resistant to actually even having those conversations, and they kind of obfuscate, you know, use a lot of red herrings and things like that to kind of confuse the issue and make it seem more complicated than it is. It's not that complicated at all, really. I think the first thing people need to understand about it is that Congress is not going to enact a bill that is going to cancel existing contracts. That on both sides, nobody's going to do that, okay? So this is going to take a long time to implement. So this is not immediately threatening to anybody. I think everyone needs to understand that, first of all. And then secondly, like I said, they're all going to make more money off of the deal. I think that the schools themselves have to speak up. You know, for whatever reason, you know, the commissioners technically work for the university presidents. And for whatever reason, you talk to the presidents privately, they're all for it. Yeah, let's do it. But then when it comes time to put pressure on the commissioners to take a position or not take a position, they just won't do it. And so then you talk to the commissioners and you say, well, why, you know, don't you know that the SBA modification would make you more money? And they all will privately say, yeah, I know it will. But I don't want to give up control of my own media rights negotiation. What does your control have to do with anything? You know, and again, protecting your position and protecting your importance and your ego and your, you know, that I could not care any less about that, you know, because I know that if we don't change something and bring more revenue in, a lot of sports are going to be cut, a lot of scholarships are going to be cut, and a lot of kids are going to lose opportunity. A lot of communities are going to be hurt. I mean, in many, especially the smaller communities, these schools are the fabric of the social fabric of everything that goes on there. You know, what is the impact? What is the impact of those communities? I know that, you know, my dad and I, when he and I have phone conversations, about 2/3 of them are about Texas Tech football, you know? So, I mean, it's important to families, you know, this is tradition. This is America. And so I really think that we're getting close to the point where the voices of those commissioners are just going to have to be ignored. And those of us who want what's best for the collective good are going to have to get together and come up with a solution that works. We're this close to that, you know? And so those guys have to make the choice. Are they gonna be a constructive part of the conversation, or are they not? And I think we're at that fork in the road. So, to put it very bluntly.
Jill, would you like to ask a question of Brent?
Yes, so thank you for being here, Mr. Copeland and Mr. Campbell. My name is Jill Pilgrim. I'm a student athlete at college
Microphone, please.
My name is Jill Pilgrim. I'm a former student athlete at the college level before women were even in the NCAA, so you know how old I am. I'm currently an attorney and a dispute resolution professional based in New York City. Mr. Copeland, I really appreciate you acknowledging that your organization, athletes.org, is one of many organizations seeking to represent the thousands of student athletes out there who are going to be turning over every several years. So I wanted to know what your organization thinks about whether student athletes should be classified as employees in order to collectively bargain, because that's the normal structure, right, legally, or whether they should have some other special status as college student athletes. So how do you view that?
Yeah, so one, we are a 501c4 trade association. We're not a 501c5 union because college athletes are not employees at this point in time. We're agnostic to the issue, right? I want to be very clear. I believe that certain college athletes could be employees and their revenue system would actually work. I think that others are in a really great situation and scenario without being employees. So I do ultimately believe that there could be a special status and special classification for college athletes where they can participate in a collective bargaining process. They can have their rights protected federally, but again, be in that special classification where they are not technically considered employees.
So, Cody, if you don't mind, I'd like to follow up on a question about amending the SBA. For a long period of time, the Knight Commission has suggested that the governance of football should be separate. And you have proposed a nonprofit that would govern college sports. Do you believe that as part of that, there should be a separate governing entity for football?
I don't like the word agnostic because of its religious implications, but I am agnostic with respect to whether they're separate or they're together. Now, I do think that it is important that we maintain focus on the educational benefit that student athletes receive in football and all the other sports, because even among football players, the vast majority of them do not go pro at the end of the day. That getting that degree and developing their character and learning the things they learn through playing football need to continue to be emphasized. That's the most important part of the sport. It's not the money. It's not even the games themselves. It's what they get off the field. And so that's my concern about it. I think that we get a little bit caught up in semantics. Are they student athletes? Are they employees? Whatever. I think we need to just say what are their rights and how are they governed. I do think that a new governing body is necessary. I think this because I look at how the NCAA runs now. It's emerged organically and has come about over 100 years, over 120 years, and it has become very bureaucratic. It's very much led by committees, and university presidents are all members of the committees who are also part of bureaucratic organizations, and so they're used to making decisions in a very institutionalized bureaucratic way. So they're slow, they're inefficient, they haven't responded quickly enough to the way that things have changed. I think having an independent body that is not directly governed by the institutions themselves is important. I think having a body that is looking out for the best long-term interest of, again, the student athletes in all the sports and all the schools is important. And I think you can look at some parts of the way that the USOPC runs and you know, again, these semantics cause problems, but a federally chartered nonprofit corporation could be a good way to do it. Now, people freak out over federally chartered. That means the government's going to control sports. That's not what that means at all. We can write the charter however we want to write it. We can make the government have as much control as we want to make it or not make it. But setting up that charter is very, very important in how it's governed. And I think you can include football in that. I don't think there's any reason why. I don't think there's an inherent reason why they have to be separated. And I think leaving them together is important because of my experience as chairman of a board of a large university, just making sure that we don't start separating revenue as well. Because that football revenue, at least for the foreseeable future, is very much necessary to make sure the other sports continue to exist. And so I get a little bit concerned when we start about separating things and classifying athletes differently in those sorts of things. I also think, like I said earlier, the situation that most even football players are in is not the situation that, as Brandon pointed out, is portrayed in the media. I mean, a very small number of them make big deals. They're making a lot of money, but the vast majority of them are there on a scholarship and then maybe a little bit in NIL money, and most no NIL money at all. That scholarship's what's very important to them. So we have to just keep in mind that this is not something where every football player is making $1 million a year. That's not the case, you know, at all. And so I think we need to still consider them, you know, setting aside what it legally means to be a student athlete, but just consider them to be students and athletes, and make sure that priority is still maintained with respect to the goals and importance of football as a sport.
Do I have a question from a commission member for Brandon? Judy?
Thank you. Brandon, thank you for being here. I actually spent most of my career at Power 2 schools. I then became president of Quinnipiac, which is a mid-major, a very successful sports mid-major. And I also chaired the MAC as a president, and we have our great commissioner here from the MAC. I think I speak for every school in the MAC and virtually every school in Connecticut, which is where Quinnipiac is, to say that we all heavily subsidize athletics. In fact, athletics hardly makes any money. It's something that we believe in and heavily subsidized, not just in very generous scholarships, but in all of the facilities and marketing and all of the infrastructure and the coaches around it. So when you talk about representation and negotiation, a very basic question, negotiating on what revenue?
Yeah, I think one great question. I think not every negotiation point is about revenue or compensation, right? I think that there's even in the NFL, I mean, there was a floor. I remember one time when we were doing the CBA, we were negotiating to make sure that certain teams actually offered certain types of treatments in physical therapy and stuff. And when you heard about how outdated some of the treatment options were for players on the Steelers versus players on the Ravens versus players on the Titans, right? Like it was setting certain benchmarks and floors. So not every negotiation would necessarily be talking specifically about compensation or compensation floors. I think that there is certain things like health insurance and practice time and mental wellness support. Right now, you know, one of the things people ask is what separates our organization from other organizations. We have over 4,800 members, and we currently serve all those members with benefits like a Pro Players Association. I'm not going to go out on the limb and say it's equal to, because we're not there yet. However, we offer them contract review, pro bono contract review, free background checks, free second medical opinions, free mental wellness support, and the opportunity to go find their agent and get them verified and vetted through a background check. Our number one most used resource today by our members is mental wellness support, right? And a lot of them are using it because they do not trust or they do not have adequate mental wellness options at their current university. So I do believe that there are certain negotiation topics that can protect the health and safety of college athletes that are more quote unquote universal. The other thing I will also mention is I think we got to take a strong look and think about, I'm going to keep using the NFL because that's what I'm from, right? And when you look at the NFL is the negotiating entity or arm of the 32 teams. And the 32 teams are its members, but those 32 teams are like franchises. And so what the Jacksonville Jaguars decides to spend on its roster, on its team, on its facilities, on its rehab, on its protocols, is different than what the Buffalo Bills decides to spend. And these teams get to choose how they want to invest in developing their players and their athletes. And so I think that schools also have the right themselves to determine how they want to invest in their athletes. However, there should still be a floor of treatment that should be negotiated by the athletes themselves, because again, my only thing, as you mentioned, Cody, as well too, is like this amending the Sports Broadcasting Act would take years, right? And we had one of the vice presidents of SAC, of the ACC SAC, and one of the things she said when we took her along with a bunch of other athletes to meet with the NCAA and some conference commissioners last March Madness. One of the things she said is, we're talking about solving all these problems in the future, and I'm going through stuff now. Like, my experience is being affected now. And so I do believe that when you have a players association or a representative body, you're not just talking about creating the right thing for the athletes today. You are also putting a check and balance in there that can hold the other side of the table accountable to those athletes 50 years from now as this game inevitably evolves as well too. So hopefully that answers your question.
So a question for Cody, and I would say we've got about 6 minutes in the session, so we should really be thinking about how brief the question is if we can, and see if we can get in another one. Yes.
I just had a quick question for.
Yeah.
So, Brandon, love the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
As an elite Olympic sport athlete, incredibly familiar with the limited resources that Olympic sport athletes face, but also as an attorney, fairly familiar with how collective bargaining agreements work, where in a typical sense you have athletes of one team negotiating with management. Now, your organization is seeking to represent all athletes.
Which is tough.
The reality of the situation is these are limited resources that we're dealing with. So, I'd love to hear more from you about how you plan to deal with competing interest, in the sense of, what happens when you have athletes of multiple teams who are now becoming adversarial with one another when it comes to competing resources and negotiating the reception of these limited resources.
Yeah, we actually went to Notre Dame University last year and got a chance to present to their athletes. And one of the first things the football players asked is, like, how can you represent my interests if you're also representing the volleyball players or the men's basketball players, women's basketball players? That's a great question. It's hard. I want to be very, very clear. Unlike most people in this world, I'll tell you, we don't have all the answers, but what we've built is a bridge and a solution to bring the right people to the table so that we can figure it out. Because as Cody said, this ain't that difficult, right? We've solved harder problems in this world. And so to answer your question directly, what we've built is every athlete that signs up, every member that signs up, they're immediately organized based off of their sport and their conference, okay, into a chapter: ACC women's basketball, SEC football, et cetera, et cetera. Our belief, and as we actually spend time educating the athletes on the different issues and topics, there's a lot of athletes. Sedona Prince, one of the plaintiffs from the House settlement, Grant House, one of the plaintiff, the lead plaintiff from the House settlement, Nia Harrison, one of the plaintiffs from the House settlement, are all members of athletes.org. Sedona Prince will be one of the first people to tell you, I'm not expecting women's basketball to get the same amount of revenue as TCU football, where she just graduated from, right? And so we believe that by educating all of these different members, but also getting support from different legal representation and organizing them well, that those our different chapters can then be able to make sure that they're facilitating their interests and pushing for all athletes as best as they can without cannibalizing each other. However, the other side of that equation is if you allow for this whole system to continue to play out, you're going to one day look up and there's going to be 5 different players associations, one representing women's basketball, one representing Olympic sports, one representing SEC football, one representing Big Ten football, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those are going to have completely competing interests, and they're going to not be able to ever come to a conclusion of who gets what and why. And then you're really going to see the system be destroyed. And so hopefully I'm answering your question, but within our organization, when we educate our athletes and treat them like the adults that they are, right? I think a lot of times we call athletes kids, but we expect them to travel across the country. We expect them to go to war. We expect them to make life-changing decisions. We expect them to sign contracts right now that have implications for their lives. But a lot of times when we educate our athletes, they understand the economics, understand the money, and they also understand the issues that they're really fighting for, and they can come to an agreement together.
Amy.
I have a question for Mr. Campbell. Thank you for being here. Amy Hackhausen. I'm a former commissioner of the America East Conference, which is a mid-major conference up in Boston. Now work in the technology sector. You identified a couple of features of the governance structure as you have sort of loosely designed federally chartered, independent, not tied to institutions. What other attributes or features of the current system would you include or not include as you look towards that new future? For example, in Division I, we are tied to a conference representation structure. We have subdivisions for different sports. Are those things that you would include or not include in the new system? And what other sort of system design elements would you have as you're mapping this out?
Well, I think that with respect to how it's legislated, I think the key is just to set up a good governing structure to start with, and then let that entity make those more specific decisions, right? So you give the athletes a seat at the table, like Brandon's talking about. You give everybody a seat at the table, and then you work through all the minutia. I don't think there's any reason why we have to necessarily blow up the conference system in this country. I mean, I think that can continue. I don't think fundamentally, ideologically, that the government should dive so deep into this issue and legislate the specifics of really anything. I think the government just needs to set up a construct and a structure where rules can be legally made and legally enforced and in a fair way. And we set up a system where we know those rules are going to be representative of everyone's interest. And that's fundamentally the problem, and why we've got to the place we have with the NCAA today, is that everyone's interest is not represented. And the reforms that have been made to the NCAA recently have just given the power conferences more power, right? That's it. So that hurts everybody. All those conferences care about is themselves, number one, but the sports that make money. I mean, and so that's why we've seen this erosion and cuts in women's sports and Olympic sports. That's why we've seen the revenue differential spread so incredibly wide in recent years. And that's why we are starting to see the system fall apart in front of us. And so I think that's what you're looking for, is just basically a clean slate, and a governing body that can actually function effectively, make rules effectively, enforce rules effectively and expeditiously. It shouldn't take years and years for decisions to be made on things. I mean, we all are aware of cases that have hung out there for 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, that's ridiculous. And there's always questions about what's legal, what's not. Each school has to have its own compliance department to even interpret what the rules are. The thing should, look at the professional leagues. They all have league offices that operate commercially and effectively and efficiently. You know, Roger Goodell can come down with a fine on a bad hit within a couple days, you know, and make decisions very quickly. And that's what we should aim for in this new era of college sports, which have become more professionalized as well. Let's look to the commercial world and you know, follow those models and look at how private companies are governed. And most of them, you know, the good ones run really well. And so why can't college sports have something similar? It's because it's grown out of this institutionalized, you know, history that just doesn't work in today's environment fundamentally.
I would like to just sneak in two more questions, but in sort of lightning round mode here. Maybe Jonathan and then John. Here, Jonathan. Yeah.
So a quick question for Mr. Campbell. I'm, by the way, president of American University here in DC, proud member of the Patriot League. We've talked a lot, and your proposals talk a lot about raising revenues and about the money, but what about the educational mission? How do we make sure that that is still front and center in the experience of these students going forward?
Yeah, I think that is, like I said earlier, the vast majority of these kids are in. We do treat them like adults, right? But they're still kids. But the majority of them are not going to go pro, right? And so getting that education and developing themselves into adults should be the most important thing. And so when we see the headlines, when we focus on the problems, and we have conversations on the Hill, we need to recognize the fact that the headlines are only addressing a very small percentage of these young people, okay? So we can't lose track of that. The number one thing that we can do is we can reduce the institutional advancement money that has to be put into athletic departments every year. That helps your academic mission more than anything. Senator Cantwell talked about it. You know, Washington State's having to throw an extra $35 million in its athletic department now. That comes from somewhere, you know, some other program's getting cut. So yeah, I think that needs to be front and center in terms of how we address the problem, is like getting that degree and growing up and developing into a productive member of society should be the primary goal as we talk about the student athlete experience.
Okay, I think we will conclude. So I want to thank both Brandon and Cody for sharing your thoughts with us today.